Hello. Thank you so much for attending my talk today titled Weight, Health, and Morality, Historicizing Schools as Agents of Biopedagogy. My name is Stephanie McCullough Campbell, and I'm absolutely delighted to be a presenter and attendee of the 2020 Fat Studies Conference. To give you an idea of my particular variant of intersectionality, I'll start with a brief intro. I'm a rising fifth-year school psychology doctoral candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I'm a cisgender woman. I've lived in the USA my entire life, but my experiences and worldview are significantly informed by my bicultural upbringing. My mother and grandma immigrated to the Philippines from the Philippines before I was born, and my mom's sisters followed soon after. It was a particularly unique childhood experience because I grew up in rural Arkansas, a town in a dry county that has only one stoplight and a population of about 1,200. Both Filipino and American contexts elevate the thin ideal, yet both traditions demonstrate love through food and hospitality. Years of mixed messaging, body loathing, and indoctrination in diet culture became exhausting. In grad school, exposure to Christy Harrison's podcast, Food Psych, dramatically changed my life and research. I was stunned to realize how the body-based norms that encompass us are issues of oppression. I entered graduate school to pursue social justice-oriented work with ethnically and racially minoritized students. School psychology, though not always well understood, is a field in which this imperative work should be, and somewhat is, happening. A central role of school psychology, at least in the USA, is to support students' ability to learn and teachers' ability to teach. By applying special expertise in behavior, learning, and mental health, school psychologists help young scholars succeed academically, socially, behaviorally, and emotionally. On the right side of the screen, I've pasted the first half of the social justice definition from our national organization. In a paper specifically outlining social justice within school psychological practice, the authors state that folks in the field should, quote, have the courage to differ in opinion from others and take responsibility for addressing social justice issues with colleagues. Working at the intersection of applied educational psychology, sociology, activism, and fat studies is my undertaking of that call. Though systemic and pervasive, bias associated with weight and size has traditionally not been considered an issue of social justice. The dominant understanding of obesity and eating disorders is largely based on individual change models, which place the impetus of change solely on the person, despite the fact that social inequities involving food, weight, power, health, and gender are significant determinants of body size. Weight-based oppression stems in part from a transgression of expectation. Fat people violate the Western conscious by violating a thinness norm. That's a quote from Eller in 2014. This standard is rooted in whiteness and perpetuated by diet culture. Words and language are powerful and can be wielded to both harm and to transform. I try to be thoughtful about word choice and use, especially in liberatory anti-oppression work. There is tension in the broader scholastic community about terms to describe fat bodies. As with many of you at this conference, I embrace the term fat as a value-free, neutral descriptor. I self-describe as a fat woman, and in the tradition of other fat studies scholars, choose this to reclaim the word, to expunge the oft-associated shame, and to reinforce its signification as a term of identity and pride. Some researchers choose to use comparative terms to describe fat bodies. For example, bigger. I find this impractical because the idea of bigger is only meaningful when compared to some anchor. If that comparison is to an assumed, undescribed thinness norm, a vague term like bigger does not allude to activist or counter-hegemonic efforts. I reject the terms of obesity and overweight. These pathologizing words reinforce the idea of size as a problem or a disease to cure. The arbitrary cut points of BMI have shifted over time and have never been grounded in actual evidence. In scholarly spaces like mine, the term fat engenders emotional triggers and general unease. Despite the fact that my work is aiming to tackle the roots of that discomfort, I've found, particularly as a non-established, no-name grad student, utility in a more palatable term when writing within my field. My advisor and I co-constructed some novel terminology, weight nonconforming or weight nonconformity. This phrase explicitly references deviation from the dominant sociocultural ideas about body size. It exclusively refers to bodies perceived to be bigger, larger, or heavier than some ideal to which they or others may hold them. Within this term, I'm aiming to acknowledge how sociocultural and political factors demand conformity, though this looks different in different contexts. I'm trying to capture that nonconforming is a neutral, typical way of being, but it can also be used to signify resistance to absurd, prejudicial societal pressures. My intention is to leverage language to sneak fat activism and body liberation into some psychological and educational literature. Weight nonconformity is my attempt at suggesting an appropriate and socially just way to discuss fat bodies. Though it would be awesome to boldly kick down the door of academia with my activist foot, I understand it can be necessary to work within existing standards and practices to gain positioning and power needed to upend such a system. Perhaps this will change once I have a real job. I bring up this lengthy spiel because I'm hopeful to generate dialogue about this topic and term. Please contact me if you have any thoughts or feedback about this. More directly related to this presentation is the word biopower. Biopower is about the value, utility, and potentiality within the body. The origin of the term is not rooted in an individual experience, but rather in person as species. Foucault conceptualized this term as he observed disciplinary power enacted to control the masses. As he called it, a body with so many heads that cannot necessarily be counted. Biopower centers upon life and the power enacted to protect or preserve it. It calls attention to efforts of intervention directed at the vital characteristics of being human. I bring up this term because I view the public, nearly ubiquitous stress of fatness as linked to biopower, particularly the discourses about, quote, obesity and, quote, health in modern society. By promoting narratives that scream, "This is health, do this for wellness," the howling entity capitalizes on the desire to protect the self and to maximize potential. With this assumption comes the possibility of squandering one's supposed potential. Another key term is biopedagogy. In the book Biopolitics and the Obesity Epidemic, Wright and Harwood use the term biopedagogy to unite the ideas of biopower and pedagogy in order to better conceptualize the body as a political space. This refers to bodies as constituted in various pedagogical sites that facilitate teaching, learning, and meaning-making. All mechanisms that inform actions and by which a person can make sense of themselves and the world. School, home, and all forms of media are some examples of these sites. Wright and Harwood assert that the concept of biopedagogy can provide a framework for analysis of the truth production associated with the, quote, obesity epidemic. But I utilize it more generally to consider the denigration of fat folks. Biopedagogies are useful when considering how power relations, modes of teaching, and interventions are enacted to promote the oppressive thinness norm. How do individuals in bodies of every size take up and enact discourses about health, weight, and the body? Sprouting from these ideas, the guiding questions of this presentation are, how have systems of education been settings for cultural reproduction that promote particular biopedagogies? In other words, health as mistakenly connected to thinness and whiteness, especially for femme-identifying and women and female individuals. How have schools promoted narratives connecting moral goodness and embodiment? Education and society, as well as social change, are inextricably linked. Educational research, in theory, should always inform social change. In a fantastic article that addresses the potential for anti-fatphobic work in school and community settings, Clare and colleagues outline the need for interdisciplinary, practice-oriented engagement. The authors explicitly mention school psychologists as potential agents of social justice via school consultation. However, this is one of the only texts in educational psychology that approaches weight nonconforming bodies in this way. Within the classroom setting, students are active agents in their transformative, subjectified position as student. Subjectification is a Foucauldian concept that is related to power relations and is antithetical to liberation. Within subjectification, individuals take themselves on as projects, delineated by particular truth discourses, under certain regimes of power, and in the so-called name of health for the individual or collective. In other words, authorities in power promote information they call truth so that people work on themselves to achieve particular results. Narratives within diet culture illustrate this well. People are not necessarily objectified, but instead have agency in subjectifying themselves to carry out what is circulated as healthy habits. The underlying authority is multifaceted, but includes entities that gain money from perpetual fat phobia and self-loathing. For example, the beauty industry or a company that sells diet pills. People turn to experts who say, loudly and unabashedly, everything a person must do to successfully obtain a body that fits that sociocultural norm. In other words, a thin one. By authorizing some voice or entity as being able to dictate what makes a correct or good body, this creates a de facto description of the abnormal, the abhorrent, the incorrect, and the bad. Similar to the discursive negotiations through which other social constructs manifest, notions of body image and fatness are driven by interactive exchanges between the individual and the ecological contexts in which they exist. Discourse is a medium of transformation, and only a few voices dominate within education, both formally and informally. The school context is crucial to identity development and in shaping children's ways of knowing. Cultural reproduction perpetuated in schools creates a division between student as family member and student in classroom, a divide that is extremely different for kids with minoritized identities. The gap in perception and understanding of self in different environments results in cultural tensions and/or erasure of minoritized identities. Since its inception, the tragic US educational system reflects racist and classist narratives that reify oppressive forces. Scientific racism embedded othering, whiteness, and anti-Blackness into the core of American schooling. These problems stem from an extensive history of inclusion and exclusion, a tradition that continues to inform the ideas of body today. The inclusion and exclusion and difference paradigm is a biopolitical paradigm that both prioritizes diverse groups while also emphasizing the differences that span between them and the dominant populace. The creation of so-called normal produces the idea of an unfit bio-other, whom the public health must save via initiatives that serve to rescue the unwell and the unproductive. Minoritized groups are constantly targeted for intervention, typically in racialized ways. There are countless examples of schools as arbiters of what is considered normal and acceptable in society, especially in regard to embodied, socially constructed characteristics. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School is one well-known example. Forced acculturation and genocide is not unique to the US. Australia's treatment and Canada's treatment of Indigenous folks has similarities to our trauma-filled history, as I'm sure many other countries. In these places, Indigenous peoples suffered rampant injustices in the name of civilization. This terrible racialized violence was not only present in the colonization of education, but also in the physical restructuring of the students' bodies. Biopedagogies dictated aspects of posture, dress, hair, speech, ways of sitting, ways of learning, and everything else. Children of colonizers and for example, when white people went to other countries, were discouraged from any assimilation to the tradition and norms of the colonized of the land where they were living. For example, Dutch kids in colonial Indies were not allowed to play with Javanese kids. These biopedagogical norms existed to prevent the white children from, quote, metamorphizing into the foreign other. Though the US is no longer forcibly removing children from their families, schooling plays a clear, significant role in how bodies are perceived and treated. Segregation and racism prominently persist in educational settings. As evidenced by the tragedies and uprisings in recent weeks, race-based struggles permeate the US consciousness. For white Americans, information received about minoritized populations is often secondhand, distorted, incomplete, and shaped by stereotypes. Colorblind racism is the norm. Especially during this political dystopia, regimes of, quote, truth are anything but. Parallels to racialized othering exist in the realm of body diversity. Ambiguous authorities, for example, Fitspo on social media or the Weight Watcher industrial complex, promote regimes of truth about what is acceptable in eating, food, and weight. This is exemplified in diet culture's devious disguise as the wellness industry. One modern federally funded example of this is a National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or NASM, consensus report titled Vibrant and Healthy Kids, Aligning Science, Practice, and Policy to Advance Health Equity. As you can probably tell, there are some pretty intense buzzwords there. NASM provides independent analysis and advice to inform national public policy decisions. Their consensus reports represent statements on topics through a culmination of peer-reviewed research and conducted by an expert community. In this report, health disparities are described as particularly impacting folks living in poverty who, statistically, tend to be Black and brown folks in the USA. This text juxtaposes an acknowledgement of unfair systems while also targeting the child's family as a vital point of intervention. This logic is broken. Historical injustices need to be addressed with solutions that move toward dismantling oppression. Instead, mechanisms by which communities and families can fix their situations are described, and some of these involve school-related initiatives. Another variety of biopedagogy in schools involves the moralization of bodies. Moralistic values are embedded in the US education system. These practices can be traced back to the 1800s and the development of monitorial and moral training schools. Monitorial schools prioritize discipline and utilize brutal grading, regulation, and training of bodies. Moral training schools were pastoral and rooted in interpersonal relationships. In their own ways, both types of schools aim to sanitize, quote, students so that they would resist rebellion and immorality. Techniques of subjectification were used to help students submit to governmental priorities. Biopower was a focal point with the goal of orderliness leading to efficiency of not only a single student, but for maximal utility of the population, including the, quote, urban poor. 19th century school practices illustrate how morality held immense value. This and other research address the intersection of hygiene, morality, and health. Some salient examples are described in the book Haunted by Empire in a chapter titled States of Hygiene, Race Improvement and Biomedical Citizenship in Australia and the Colonial Philippines. Anderson expressed that for particular populations and specific times and places, civic responsibility is delineated through performance of bodily self-government and moral self-possession. In the Philippines, Dr. Victor G. Heiser, an American white male physician, established the Culion leper colony. Filipino folks with leprosy were transferred and held there beginning in 1906. Because their medical needs were physically apparent and because of their lack of socialization, folks with leprosy were targeted for a process of normalization. Dr. Heiser considered the removal of lepers from their families and communities as a civilizing and progressive move. Here are some images of the colony. Though they were removed from larger Filipino society, residents of Culion sustained their own version of community, complete with a 40-piece band. As you might imagine, the captives of Culion deeply resented their separation, both from the rest of the nation, but also from their children. Beginning in 1915, babies born in the colony were removed from families to eventually be adopted or handed over as wards of the country. This section of a 1913 piece about the Culion leper colony highlights how morality and informed their internment. This language demonstrates the apparent pride and moral superiority embedded into this bio-rescue mission. It really praises how courage and marvelous it was for people to take care of these poor, brown, sick people, and compares it to Jesus Christ himself. Individuals continued to live in the colony for decades, eventually becoming an official municipality in the early 1970s. Culion was not declared a leprosy-free by the World Health Organization until 2006. Anderson's chapter draws connections between similarities in colonial rule in the Philippines and Australia. As with the tragedy of Native folks in the US and Canada, both situations involve examples of children being taken from their homes so white people might pursue their idea of civility, one defined by a distinct variety of body. The production of norms in the aforementioned examples may sound extreme, but our modern notions of civilization are not far from them. These days, oppression can manifest surreptitiously. The body ideal of a fit, efficient, productive citizen continues to be heralded as a moral imperative and is steeped in whiteness. Sabrina Strings, sociologist and author of Fearing the Black Body, the racial origins of fatphobia, draws sophisticated connections between fatness and the crafting of legitimate sex, quote, legitimate sex, race, and class hierarchies in the US. Beyond the, quote, normal being quite literally defined by a white male example, in other words, the bogus roots of BMI, notions of individual agency perpetuate misconceptions about fatness. Modern beliefs about, quote, health consider it an independent moral responsibility to make good choices about food and exercise. Individualistic, whitewashed processes drive the promotion of shame through the medium of diet culture and sustain fatphobia in society. This variant of biopower amplifies and perpetuates weight stigma. Schools, both currently and historically, transmit biopedagogies that, even when not obviously fatphobic, synthesize oppressive, racist ideologies. The supposed proper bodily aesthetic associated with, quote, healthy bodies just so happens to align with Eurocentric, capitalist promoting ideals. Schools are unique environments in which liberatory anti-bias work can and should occur. Unfortunately, a socially just perspective on white diversity is poorly represented in peer-reviewed works, especially in educational scholarship. There is little theoretical work in psychology to understand the recursive relationship between generating scholarship and about inequity and doing the work of social justice activism. I intend to change that. Though I don't have many detailed suggestions, I hope that this talk and the networking made possible in the Fat Studies community will open doors to collaboration and further development of school-based, kid-focused social justice work. A few broad suggestions for the future include intervention at the level of the teacher, decolonizing research methodologies, as well as immediate, ceaseless pursuance of anti-racism through culturally responsive practices. One important first step toward a more equitable future is learning from BIPOC researchers, creators, activists, and artists. My exposure to folks like Sonia Renee Taylor, Roxanne Gay, Sabrina Strings, and Virgie Tovar, among many others, has been life-altering. Most of all, this social justice work requires school professionals to be exposed to and familiar with the impact of weight bias and fatphobia. Sociologists and psychologists need to produce and promote translational work that can help to dismantle systemic oppression of people with weight nonconforming bodies. Nowhere is this more urgent than in the United States. In a presentation I recently recorded for the International Conference on Eating Disorders, I overview extant school-based interventions that target body image and weight bias. All but one of the 20 reviewed studies took places in other countries. Though disappointing, the finding was not surprising. There's an extreme lack of work regarding weight-related issues in US schools. If you're interested in my other talk, it's linked in this QR code. Though peer-based literature set in the US context is limited, practitioners and researchers should attend to the scant articles that progressively address fatphobia and weight bias in schools. Clare and colleagues provide 5 social justice-oriented guidelines to engage in school-based consultation. First, assess one's own beliefs and values around fat bodies. Then, be aware and on the lookout for behaviors that signify fat bias. Third, collaborate with service providers to provide equitable wellness programming. And then to be involved with local policy and advocacy to protect the health and dignity of folks with weight nonconforming bodies. The last suggestion is to engage in dialogue and activism to A, counter fat phobia, and B, support health and dignity of all students. And I really wanted to emphasize there how she framed this as health and dignity. I feel like instead of framing this as something to be solved and a problem that needs to be fixed, if we just want dignity and health for everyone, I think we would see the world differently. In my work, I've developed a dissertation project about a critical dialogic intervention aimed at reducing racism and weight stigma. Participants will be 5th grade teachers and, pandemic permitting, their students. Thank you so much for your attention. Salamat kanimo. References are provided in the transcript of this talk, and the QR code will take you there. I would love to hear your feedback, thoughts, critiques, or anything else. My contact info is on the slide, and the QR code will direct you to my website. Have a great rest of the conference.